Step into the ring of the unconscious. Confront yourself and win. This is Shadowboxing, a show about personal battles within. All right, thanks for tuning in to the Shadowboxing podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Tyler.
And I'm Nick.
I was going to say, Nick, that's your line.
Yeah.
All right, here's the quote for the week. And this is Nick's quote. It is convenient that there be gods, and as it is convenient, let us believe there are. The quote's attributed to someone called Ovid. Do you know who Ovid is?
Ancient Roman poet.
Ah, okay.
Publius Ovidius Naso? Is that how you say it, I think? Yeah, we just call him Ovid.
Commander of the Legions of the North?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, the poets of the North, I guess. Born 43 BC. So yeah, he's an old guy. I went with this quote because it's something I've thought about for a couple of years now. And it all kind of centers around people's varying ideas of God and gods and what those might be, you know, from the literal to the symbolic. And then, of course, there's the people who just disregard the concept altogether. But one thing I have noticed in the last few years is that people with deep actual faith in something seem a lot more content and centered than many atheists. And that sort of ties back to the quote, if for no other reason, like it is convenient, because apparently it gives people purpose. So why not believe, if for no other reason?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard, studies say that people who have a strong belief system are happier in their relationships and in life. And I don't know if that's always the case. It probably isn't. But, it makes sense on the grounds that, I think all of us kind of want to be grounded in something. There's an anxiety of just kind of not knowing exactly what's going on in the universe and what, if there is a purpose, what our purpose is, and, what truly is right and wrong, and what kind of course your life is supposed to take. So it makes sense that if you have that foundation of a core belief system, that you're going to kind of just be content and accept the chaos that's going on in the world, and kind of just go with the flow.
And probably end up chaotic yourself and contributing to it, because it seems to me, we're going to get into perennialism or perennial philosophy at some point in this. Yeah, I know. It seems to me like the sort of foundation, or one of the foundations of most, if not all, religions, probably all, like even Satanism, the foundation of LaVeyan Satanism is don't be a piece of shit. Mm-hmm. And so if everybody even just started there without knowing exactly, what their greater purpose might be, I guess, that is, a call to something in and of itself. Because our natural impulse, I think, is generally to be a piece of shit in some way. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it's in a way we're not even aware of. Like, we don't know we're being a piece of shit. It's just... So if you start from not only don't be a piece of shit, but try to be a good person, that's, I don't know, a good foothold mm-hmm. for everything else.
Right. That's a good North Star. It gets you in the general direction.
Right.
And I know what you mean about I think a lot of people don't want to admit that they're neutral as being a piece of shit, because I think people are so averse to being disliked or hated. But the truth is that if it weren't for societal norms and customs and your parents raising you to be a decent person, we would all be pretty selfish crap flinging assholes, right?
Yeah, I mean, we already struggle for dominance, all of us, just in different ways, like social ways.
Yeah.
Without those norms, it would be, probably like violence. Or assuming we were still as capable of speech and stuff, I guess the alternative to that would be just constant manipulation and inauthenticity to get a leg up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if there weren't the checks and, of people on you, like, trying to kind of regulate each other to be good people, then yeah, you would just constantly be like a rat race to get the things that you wanted out of people, if that meant lying and manipulating people. Yeah. One thing that I think is really interesting about this quote is that it reminds me of kind of like the overarching premise of like a lot of what Jordan Peterson talks about is like one of his quotes, because people were like, so are you a Christian or aren't you a Christian? And like his response was, I behave as though God exists. And his whole angle has been looking at Christianity from kind of a reductionist psychological perspective rather than as a believer. And I think that's opened the door for a lot of people who may have been hesitant to delve into Christianity, but like it opens it up to like more of a, let's look at this from a scientific observation perspective. But what I think is interesting about the quote is the idea that it's convenient to believe in something. What I take from that is that if you believe in something purely out of convenience, or like Jordan Peterson, you believe something because you want to hedge on the side of like, well, having this belief is better than not.
Right.
Does that affect how much you take that to heart? Do you like actually believe it?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I definitely think that is probably the case most of the time. Like, because if you're aware, you're only believing in it because it's doing something for you, where when push comes to shove, you may just stop out of, again, convenience.
Right.
Because you're aware it's not a... Well, no, because that's something I've thought about. And that's another reason I like this quote more and more as I read it. So since I've noticed that people with some sort of faith in something tend to be more content, fulfilled, purposeful, because the unifying thing is because they all believe in, let's call it a higher power or powers, then to me that means that thing does exist. Like, that is evidence that it exists. It has an impact on humans to such a consistent degree. Now, I guess the question is, what is that? And when people hear God and gods, I think part of my problem in the past, not that this is a problem for everyone, is that it was always explained to me as if this thing was like an entity, like sort of physical, but not physical. It had a gender, which, doesn't make sense to me now. Like, it has all these things that required a body of some kind, yet nowhere is that visible. So how would anyone know it has a body? But as a concept, or as a, I hate to use the word force, and I don't think it's right and it's overused, but as a force, that's sort of...
What about an energy?
I hate that word even more, but yes, I mean, it works. Contextually, it works. Something like that. It is something that exists metaphysically.
See,
to me.
It's funny that you're trying to pinpoint like a good word to use to describe this concept. And
right.
And I think that's precisely why historically this concept has been described in terms that as you said, don't quite fit the bill, right? Like, why does God have a gender? Why is God seen as a person, but also like isn't a physical being, but is described as one? And I think it's because precisely that. It's so hard to pinpoint what this thing is that you have to give it certain characteristics in order to carry the conversation forward. Like, if you were to say, well, God doesn't have a gender, it's like, well, then how do you describe God in the second person? Like, you can't say it because it implies an object.
You mean third person?
Sorry, is that third person?
Yeah. Second person is you.
Oh.
Yeah, and I actually do sometimes refer to it as it. It does sort of imply an object, but that's only because we have the connotation on it. Like, calling someone an it makes everybody be like, that's an insult.
Right, it's dehumanizing.
Right. And which is actually my purpose in this case, dehumanizing it, because I don't think it's human, which might get me in some trouble because, like, we were created in God's image. Well, when I hear the word image, I don't think physically at all. Mm-hmm. I think that means essentially capable of self-awareness.
Right. Right, and I don't necessarily think that there's a right or wrong way to describe God. But I do think that, like, whatever way you choose to describe God is either going to turn your audience off or on, depending on their perception or their angle. Right. So you mentioned perennialism earlier, and for people who are listening who don't know what perennialism is, to explain it really crudely, what it is the concept that there are ancient truths that have been passed down through different schools of thought, be it philosophical, theological, and that it is paramount that humans maintain that tradition of passing down those values and stories and lessons, regardless of their origins. And someone who describes himself as a perennialist might say that they subscribe to many different philosophies or religions, and derive meaning from them equally. So
the way I think about it is basically all major, if not all, religions and philosophies in the world are all trying to get at the same point.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the same underlying meaning. Right. And that's how I think about it.
Yeah, they're all trying to get to the same truth, but they might be describing it in different ways using different stories. And I've described myself as a perennialist because I like to study Eastern religions and philosophy as well as Western. And I think that there are parallels between them, and I'm very interested in the parallels. For instance, historically, right, there's a lot of different... The story of Noah and the Great Flood, you can find that same story in a ton of different cultures throughout the world, as one example. But one thing that I think is interesting in my personal journey is that it's hard to believe in something concretely when you're kind of, for lack of a better term, picking and choosing what you think is important from any of these given religions.
Right.
So like, recently I've been trying to kind of narrow down how I might describe myself to someone, and I think of all the different schools of thought that I've studied, I would say that I most align with Buddhism. And so
makes sense.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, I don't want to describe myself as a Buddhist, and
right.
And so it brings me back to this point that this quote I think is talking about is like, if you're doing something or believing in something out of convenience alone, like, is that enough? The convenience obviously is, there's value there, but like, how do you get to the point where you believe something so fanatically that you're willing to die for it?
I guess that would be the question, really, of true belief in some.
right,
deity entity.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of skipped a few steps getting to that statement. I don't think necessarily that like you have to believe in something so much that you're willing to die for it.
But no, it took me a minute. Like, that's where the pause was. I get how you connected the two things, but like, there is an element to that. That would be the most extreme belief in something. I think
exactly.
Like
that's
that,
yes.
Just like
you got there. But that's kind of how I see it. Is like, can you study something in your adult life and reach a conclusion that is what you believe in, and you believe it so ardently that you would be willing to die for it? I think people that are raised in a specific religion, it might be easier for them to subscribe to that belief in that way, especially if their entire community also believes that and it's reinforced within that. But in the modern world, where we have a world full of non-religious people, mostly agnostic, some atheist, and then a lot
those aren't mutually exclusive.
No, they're not. Thank you. Yeah, but also like people who claim to be of a specific religion who are not very fervent about it. Like, you hear a lot of people say they're Christian, but then like their behavior isn't very Christ-like, in everyday, from day-to-day stuff. So,
well, the funny thing is, I would say those people aren't even embodying like the quote. They don't believe because it's convenient. I think those people are people who just grew up in it and it had lost all meaning, and it was just, this is what I've always called myself. And like the belief isn't there's no emotion attached to the belief, essentially. I think people who have emotion attached to their belief are more likely to act in accordance with that belief. And then there are people who just wear it as if it was a crucifix around their neck. And that's it.
Right. Well, and it's interesting that
it's like an aesthetic label at that point.
Yeah, well, no, and that's exactly where I was going with it. It's interesting that you say it like that, because I feel like in our modern Western consumerist society, people's identity is very much tied to aesthetic. Like, have you noticed? My God,
that's true. Yeah.
People driving around with bumper stickers that are related to Harry Potter or Star Wars and it's so interesting because I don't remember that as a kid. Like, as a kid, bumper stickers were always tied to politics for the most part, or charities that you donated to. But it was like people really wanted to make it known to the person driving behind them what their beliefs were. But now it's very much like, these are the things that I consume in our society. Like, my identity is I'm a Harry Potter fan who likes Starbucks and I listen to NPR.
Yeah, no, I mean, our spiritual allegiances at this point really are to like political identities and corporate brands.
It's so crazy.
Yeah. Yep.
But that's the thing. I think a lot of like to your point, I think there's a lot of Christians out there that are like, this is just part of my aesthetic. Like, this, and maybe like loosely my moral framework is based on, that premise. But there's not much more to it than that. And, with everything going on in the world, where there are literally people in other countries who are fighting and dying for their religion, it's so crazy for us to fathom that here. I've been talking to a lot of people about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and not to dive into that at all, but like one thing that stands out is people are like, why must people fight about religion? And they think that it's like asinine to do that, or it's outdated. And it's like, sure, okay, I see why you think that, because nobody likes violence and people shouldn't be fighting over something abstract like that. But at the same time, like, I don't think people see that and go, wow, those people really, truly, fanatically believe in their religion.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, I don't think there really is that much of that in the world because, like, Israel and Hamas aren't fighting because of their religions. Mm-hmm. Like, their religions, I don't think, dictate that they fight, mm-hmm. is what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. And religion is not the core issue. Religion is kind of just the aesthetic covering for this one group of people that feels this way about this situation and another group that feels this way about this situation in their living environments. Mm-hmm. And religion just happens to be the unifying thing. Like, I don't think that Israel and Palestine are mainly fighting because of their religion. I think they're fighting because of a territorial dispute. And yes, there's Holy Land surrounding it, but that's really what it is.
That's fair. That's definitely fair, I think. But I guess, like, narrowing it down to, like, the individual fundamentalist Islamic terrorist who straps a bomb to his chest and blows himself up, like, that person has to believe that when they die, they're going to be rewarded for that deed. Otherwise, like, what is compelling them to do that? The only other place... I mean,
it would either be that or, like, if they were doing it, like, because, like, I have to do this for my family or something. Right. But that's... The further you get away from them, the harder that becomes to justify. So,
mm-hmm. Well, right, because then I think about, like, Imperial Japan, right? Kamikaze pilots. Like, that wasn't religious fanaticism. That was more like nationalistic fanaticism.
It was like my people or my country, but probably the people, really.
Right, the people making up the country. I mean, yeah, not so much like the national idea so much as, like... Because it was an empire. The emperor was seen as like a demigod. So it was kind of, I think, probably more racial or ethnic in that case. But still, those are two groups of people that have a belief so strong that they're willing to commit suicide over it, which is so perplexing to me because it seems really hard to think about being so sure of anything like that, to that extent. I mean, that's and that's the funny thing is, like, we grew up in the environment where those sort of loyalties transition to, again, like political identities and brands, and it's like those are so empty. Political identities, maybe it has a point, probably more outside of the U.S., I would say, because there's more representation. But here, it's just it's a joke. It's a aesthetic. It's not something anybody's going to die for. Mm-hmm. Particularly the brand thing. So it's so shallow, and I think that's contributing to people's spiritual discomfort because. I don't know. I feel like if somebody had something they were willing to die for, they'd probably be pretty content. Yeah. Yeah, or I would even reframe it to say that I would think that if a person was not afraid of what happened after they die, then suddenly life becomes a lot easier to bear.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's true, too, to a degree.
I mean, we've talked about death before in conversations, but, like, I've kind of felt that if you can accept what life is in the terms of some type of belief system, and then you believe that something happens after you die, whether it be, you go to heaven and live in eternal bliss, or you're reincarnated, or... you go to nirvana or something, right? Just like, mm-hmm. I mean, and you're certain that that's what's going to happen. I mean, life itself loses its importance because it's no longer finite. Like, existence carries on in one way or another. And so, tying it into the quote, like, I don't think it's only convenient to believe in a God. I think it's imperative, because otherwise I just feel like life would be so anxiety riddled, right? Because you know that you're only moving forward. Time is only continuing. It never pauses. It never rewinds. And then when it's over, it's over. Like, that is such, to me, if I compare that to any other type of way of thinking about the world, that is the scariest way to think about it.
Yeah, well, and I think the difference here because I like the word convenient, and I know you like imperative, like you said, and the way you're explaining it, it makes sense. But the way I think about it, my angle on perverting convenient is because when I hear the word imperative, it makes me think like you literally cannot live unless you believe this. And I'm like, well, that's not true. There's all these exceptions. Mm-hmm. When I hear convenient, I start to think like, okay, well, what is convenient about this? What's useful about it? And then you can start to list things like, well, people that believe tend to be more this, tend to be more this, tend to be more this. So I like it because imperative to me is much more narrow. Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Whereas,
I see what you're saying, because I think we get to the same place.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. That the benefits vastly outweigh the disadvantages.
That's what it is. Yes.
Or that the absence of it leaves you with so much negative aspects, for lack of a better term, that like it just makes more sense to do so.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, like in that. Sorry, I am talking a lot. Did you have a point that you want to make about this quote?
No, we're good.
Okay, good.
I've been chirping it when I went to. Yeah. No,
okay, cool. When you mentioned this quote, like it definitely popped out to me, and I was like, "Ooh, this is juicy," because like this is something I think about quite a bit. Is like trying to really define my belief system. And like I would say that if I had to try and explain how I view the world, or at least how I'm trying to view the world, is that this is all just one big dream. And that when we die, you either go into another dream of a different existence, or you wake up. And that is, in very crude terms, like how I try and see the world. And if I look at it that way, rather than thinking that this is reality, like what is reality, really? Because if this is reality, then anything outside of this either doesn't exist or isn't real. And so if you think about the afterlife as non-existence, like I'm sure you've heard this from people before, but there's people that believe that when you die, you just cease to exist and there's just nothingness. And they're like, oh, isn't that frightening? And you're like, well, no, because like if you cease to exist,
you wouldn't be aware.
You wouldn't be aware of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But humans struggle so much with comprehending the non-awareness aspect, that like even just having something where you're like, well, your awareness, if your awareness gets transferred somewhere else, it's a known scientific principle that all the energy that exists in the universe already exists. Right. So like it just gets transferred into a different form. And when I think about it that way, it's like a little bit easier to digest.
Yeah, no, I think that's basically what I believe too. And I think that's more Eastern religion oriented, because the whole cyclical thing, and that's one problem I have with, I was going to say Western religion, which is basically just Abrahamism, is it's very linear. And the other thing, and I just realized this as you were talking, is basically that's kind of describing reincarnation in very broad terms. Like maybe you're not reincarnated literally as an animal, but some part of you is transferred into something that continues.
Yeah.
And with Western religion, it was like you're born, you die, you get one shot at this, and then you either suffer forever or you exist forever in eternal paradise. And it's like, oh, and also as far as like rebirth goes, only one guy gets to do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm like, I don't know. Like, I feel like only one shot? Really? You only get one shot? like, there's a lot of situations with a population this big and this disparate and this lacking in belief where it's like, I don't know, maybe they could use a couple shots.
Right. Like, and I think about it in terms of like, if you sit down in a chair and you're like, here's a video game, and you play it and you die immediately, and you go, oh, okay, I'm starting to get the hang of this, and they go, nope, that was your one shot. We're basing our entire credit score off of that. Like, you're like, wait a minute, I didn't even learn what I was doing yet.
It's a little bit fear-based, which is something that caused me to reject Christianity in my youth extra hard, was that, like, there was always this element of, like, fear behind it.
I concur completely. Like,
and I'm like, don't make me afraid of something that, like, you can't prove exists. And that's one thing I like about Buddhism, is it's like, these behaviors will lead to your suffering, like, in this life. So maybe not.
Right, and it makes me wonder if that was always the intent of Christianity, or if something was lost in translation, because, you know...
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Yeah.
Because, like, sometimes I try and think about the heaven or hell in terms of more like a Buddhist sense, where it's like you going to hell isn't what happens after you die. You going to hell is what happens when you make bad choices in your life. Like, when you're at rock
Peterson's
bottom.
described stuff kind of like that, too.
Yeah.
And I really get that. And I'm like, okay, yeah, like, it's... Now that I'm like, okay, there's a lot of things about Christianity I appreciate. Like, if somebody could follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, they would be a perfect human being as far as I'm concerned, which is probably something pretty important to hold on to. And... Oh, I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, I'll say this. Like, one aspect of Christianity that I think is... It was a monotheistic religion that was propagated by the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah.
So, I wonder if a lot of the teachings were bastardized a long time ago to help promote the concept of having one leader. Right, like it's fairly well known that, like, the reason whatever emperor, I don't remember his name, said that Christianity was going to be the religion of the empire was having a monotheistic religion helped reinforce the concept of adhering to the rules of the emperor. You know, and so
I can see that.
So
could just do it the Egyptian way, where the pharaoh himself is a god.
Right. Yeah. Take it all the way to the extreme. But, like, the concept of, you know, fear because you only get one shot at this life is kind of balanced out in Christianity by saying, well, you can always ask for forgiveness at any point in time.
That's true. Yeah, that is the counterweight. Yep.
Right. There's always the ability to ask for forgiveness. So that fear is counterbalanced with, but if you're really sorry for what you did, then it's okay. That doesn't negate the fact that it's still very fear-based, but fear is a good tool for keeping people in line.
It is definitely a good tool, and I guess that's where the question comes, is like, was that stuff being passed down to just keep people in line by men? Or was it people... I guess it really depends on the angle, like the intents of the leaders. If the leaders were like, our people are suffering and we need to alleviate their suffering, and they did that, then it's not so bad. Right. If they were like, we need to do this to just keep our thumb on people, then it's bad. But then you think about the lessons that are taught, and it seems to me like it's more generated to alleviate suffering.
Right. Right. Well, and I mean, that goes back to the idea of, like, if you really believe something, are you going to derive more value from it than if you kind of passively believe something? Because, like, it's really hard to find an example in modern day that I can equate it to. But
so what if you just don't specify? What if I say I believe in the point of nearly all religions? Is that sufficient? If I say I believe in... That's why ascribe to perennial philosophy is because I'm like, no, that's right. There is a point that they're all trying to get to. So would belief in the point, if not the literalism of any religion, be sufficient? If you believe in the core idea, even if you can't apply a label to that, really, wouldn't that be enough?
That is the crux and of what I'm trying to determine, because like I don't know if it is, you know. Sometimes I wonder if I would find more contentment and peace if I were able to pick a specific religion and say, this is what I believe, and I believe it 100%. Like, this is what's going on. This is how I can explain the universe to myself, rather than kind of going, well, I know that all of this is beneficial for me, and you know, and reminding myself of that from time to time is going to kind of bring me back to center. But would I be happier? Would I be more content if I could say that I believe that X, and this is what I need to do in order to live a better life? And I'm not sure.
I guess that stems, to me, like, you could just call yourself a perennialist then. Or a perennial deist or theist or whatever. Like, you could just be like, I'm a perennial philosopher and I believe in a higher power. And that's sufficient, because everything else anyways branches out from that.
Right.
The specific values, and it's like, okay, you can, if you can take from the roots of all religions and join them into one idea, it's because there are actually not that many roots, just very thick, strong ones. You have, don't be an asshole. You have, try to respect life. And you have, try to contribute something positive in the world. Like those three tenets, basically. If you were to just follow that, I mean, you'd probably have a pretty awesome, successful life.
Yeah. No, and that's
true. And you can call that whatever you want, but like that's what all religions are getting to.
No, you're right, and that is kind of like, that is what you do as a perennialist, is like say, well, the crux of all of these different things is what I believe in. But it does leave, let me put it this way. I just kind of thought of this. So, like, if you have a diehard belief system, it takes a lot of the ambiguity or guesswork out of the decisions that you make in life. So, like, someone who is fervently conservative or fervently progressive or fervently libertarian. Let's choose libertarian because I know that one the best. If someone's fervently libertarian, then they've read all the dogma literature out there, right? Like, they've read Murray Rothbard, and they've read whoever else, fill in the blank. But a lot of the time when you try and have a conversation with that person, they can just refer to the dogma and go, well, this is how it would work in a libertarian society, and this is how I would behave, and this is how I feel about X, Y, or Z. And it takes a lot of the guesswork out. And I've looked at that and said, well, you're pigeonholing yourself, because now you no longer have as much of the ability to be flexible when faced with certain scenarios. Like, you have like a rigid moral framework. Whereas someone who's a perennialist might say, like, well, I need to look at each individual thing. Sometimes a white lie may not be, it might actually benefit the situation, or or maybe sometimes, like, I need to be assertive in this situation and stand up for this belief. But other times, maybe I'll sit back and let it slide because it's better for the outcome of this scenario. Do you get what I'm saying? And so sometimes I wonder if just having that rigid framework in your life makes things easier, because then you don't have to worry about if you're making the right decision. Instead of making the choice, you're just following the rule book.
Yeah.
Right, like lying is a good example. I can think of a lot of instances in my life where a little white lie is not a bad thing. Like a blatant lie, a blatant bold-faced lie in order to get something that you want is bad. That's universally bad. Like it's because it's just dishonest.
My first thing I think of isn't like to getting something you want. It's to avoid accountability.
Or to avoid accountability.
Yeah, both of those things are shitty. Yes.
Yeah, but even better. Yeah, I agree. Like trying to get out of blame by lying is really immoral. But someone who has rigid moral framework would say, "I never lie," and I can think of instances where not lying actually could make the situation worse, right?
Sure.
Like breaking somebody's heart because you told them something that maybe didn't necessarily need to be said, but because you were asked, you didn't want to lie, and you felt that if I choose not to answer, that is just as bad as lying. So I'm always going to be honest, and I'll tell you exactly how I feel. Yes, your ass looks big in that dress, you know. But
yeah, no, I get that. That was a big conflict I had in a past relationship, is because one person was like, I just don't want to make you feel bad, and the other person was like, I don't want to lie to you.
Right. So, you know, and I just wonder if that, like, maybe that would be a better existence. I'm not sure, but I can definitely say that the foundations of Christianity have had a lasting impact on the way I view the world, because there is this idea of like, you've got one shot at this life, don't screw it up. And I think because of that, I tend to be more cautious than is beneficial for me. Like, I don't take as many chances, because when you take big risks, it has long-lasting consequences. And so it's better to play it safe, right? Whereas, like, if you were to look at the world and say, hey, this is just a game, it doesn't matter what happens in this life, like, you're just going to float on to the next thing when this is all over, then maybe you're more willing to, like, potentially screw it up, right? Like a lot of people are afraid of, you know, dying poor, dying homeless, because they took wild chances in their youth. So instead of like taking those big risks to potentially have a larger impact on the world, you just kind of slowly collect resources and hedge yourself against possible, you know, fallouts. And then at the end of the day, you're like, hey, I made it. I made it to the finish line, and I'm not so bad off.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, what you just said reminds me of something my dad used to say. Me and my brother rock climbing as a metaphor. He's like, you would climb, talking to me. It's like, you would climb to not fall. And he's like, your brother would climb to get to the top. He's like, who do you think got there faster when you guys were younger?
Ah.
And that's always resonated with me. And I think you can tie that to this theme where it's like that fear of, you know, failing and ending up poor. Mm-hmm. That's like the person climbing to not fall. Like, yeah, you're clinging to the wall, but you're not going to get to the top. Whereas a person who is able to just not fear if they fall will go straight to the top, as long as they don't fall. But we had ropes attached to us. So, like, and I guess you could consider faith a sort of a rope like that. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Is like being able to be like, look, this isn't something holding me back. This isn't something I'm afraid of. Mm-hmm. It might get annoying and in my way a little bit, but now I can try to shoot to the top as quickly as possible because this rope is here if I fall.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's, you know, like, if you don't have a belief system, it's almost like all you have is your intuition. And you have to wonder what your intuition's based on, you know?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Like, if you believe, hey, this life is meant for living and there is a purpose to it and I'm supposed to learn something, maybe you're willing to venture out a little bit farther and experience things that you may have been hesitant to otherwise. And I kind of think that that's like a big point of it, of having a belief system, that it's like, this is meant for me to experience, rather than like just trying not to die, or just
I'm
trying
stuck
not
here without my own consent and I'm afraid of pain and this ceasing.
Yeah.
And like, that's it. That's your entire existence.
Right.
No, I've been there. It sucks.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like when I was younger, I was a Christian and I wanted to join the
Same.
military. And like my whole thing was I wanted to see combat. And I remember my stepdad asking me, I know, well, I was a kid, I mean, like, I thought that was like, I thought that was important.
It's
Like,
glamorous.
it's like honor. You're like, oh, honor, that's important, right? What is it? I don't know,
well,
but it sounds important.
And we were at the tail end of like the last nationalistic group, basically, coming out of World War II and stuff. So all that stuff was like taught to us as cool and respectable and a purpose.
Right, right. And we got a lot of that from Hollywood and stuff, and from culture, but... But it was, I remember my stepdad asking me, he goes, well, what if you're the guy on Saving Private Ryan in the boat who before the door even drops, you just get domed around to the head and you instantly die? And I remember telling him that I'm like, well, if that's what is supposed to happen to me, that's what happens. Like, like that's what you do. And it's so interesting because, like, by the time I joined the military, my worldview had drastically changed. I was much more atheistic by the time I was 18 versus when I was 12. And so my whole view of the world had changed to the point where I was like, I shouldn't just take a combat role. I should do something that'll give me a skill for the future, something that's recession-proof. And that's why initially I almost became an electrician's mate. I was like, oh, becoming an electrician on a ship, that'll get me a job when I get out. And that's such a different mindset to have than I'm going to go join the infantry and potentially face my death because, like, I feel like that's my destiny, based on my belief structure.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, and so I think, like... Now, at this point in my life, in my 30s, I'm trying to kind of maybe get back to that mindset of like, there's a reason for this. There's a reason I am where I am right now. And it's not because I'm supposed to maybe just hedge my bets and always bet on the safe route until I get old and die. And that doesn't mean that I think that I'm meant for greater things or anything. Like, I don't think that, like, the goal is to become famous or the goal is to become wealthy. It's just necessarily maybe I should be more open to suggestion, and maybe I should be more willing to experience new things, and maybe I should be willing to step out and take a bold risk on something just to see how it plays out.
Yeah. Well, now that's interesting you say that because, like, that mentality you just described is kind of how I am innately. And it's not even, there's no thought behind it. I'm just literally like, oh, cool new thing that appeals to me. I'm just going to go chase this and see what happens. Mm-hmm. So I've always been like that. So it's interesting to hear you describe that as transitory for you because I probably need to go the opposite way. And I kind of am in certain ways where I'm just looking for something very concrete.
Something more foundational.
Yeah, and even if it's something that I have to, like, chase, like, even if it's something I'm not sure is a sure thing, just having one thing, like, if it's something I'm not sure is a sure thing, I know I can make it a sure thing. Because I've spent so much of my life chasing these multiple different things, it kind of has at this point diverged into a core idea, like the perennialism thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be a difference in the way we think is like I started from, hey, let me hit all these branches and then go find the trunk. And you probably started as the trunk, where it was just like I have this very firm idea of what it is I believe and what I want, and there it is. And now I guess you're getting to the branches, where you're like, hey, what is this thing that I'm willing to just go at?
Yeah, well, and that's probably true. Like, I definitely think that I got steered off a course and spent a lot of time wandering, and I'm kind of just getting back to where that course was and going, hey, maybe there was something here. Like, maybe I should have been bolder. not trying to dwell on it, rather just say like, hey, maybe that is a tool that I dropped along the way that I should pick back up and maybe use now, you know, like it's hard to think of an example, but you know, like maybe when you have a good idea, maybe it's worth, you know, dropping some effort and some money into it just to see if it pans out, and if it doesn't, being like, okay, that didn't pan out, you know. I think this podcast is a good example of it, except that like there's a very low barrier to entry, right? Like there's nothing lost by publishing this podcast. On the upside, maybe,
that does make it.
Yeah, maybe on the upside, somebody listens to it and they get something out of it, and they go, hey, at the very least, like that was super interesting and it gave me something to think about. You know, but I'm thinking more...
and that's actually when I was talking to you earlier about, I was like, I don't care about like the number of viewers. I just enjoy this as a regular thing. But that actually is something that I would be glad about. So is if like one person heard it and was like, oh, I got something convenient, or what was the word you used earlier? The I word. Imperative. Yeah. It's like if somebody comes and listens to this and is like, I got something imperative or convenient out of it, good enough for me.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I mean, and I think about that in terms of like other things too, like, you know, like a business idea or pursuing a passion or something, which, you know, like, I've been doing that with my competition shooting. It's like, hey, I'm going to drop a bunch of money into this and I'm going to try and get really good. And if it doesn't work out, I'm not going to look back and go, oh man, I wasted a lot of time and a lot of money pursuing something that didn't bear any fruit. That's okay. You know? Right. Yeah. You know, trying to grow a YouTube channel. But yeah, and to the same effect, like with this, I hope to make a podcast with a high enough quality that it reaches enough people that it can impact somebody. You know, like I want it to be good enough that one person, like, you know, at least one person listens to it from start to finish. That would be really cool to me. But I want to be able to like expand that to other things too. Like I want to go to the roulette table, Nick, you know, and I want to put it all on red, and I just want to spin the wheel and see what happens. You know what I mean? And like be willing to do that. And say if it lands on black and I lose it all, that's okay, because like it's not over. Like there's gonna be something else.
Yeah, now that makes a lot of sense. And again, that's another difference. Like I have always been someone who was like red or black, and I can win 2 times the money, and I'm like, well, like I came in here knowing I might lose money and just doing it just to see what happens. Like not even needing that cushion of like, oh, it's going to be okay. For me, it was just pure impulsivity. Yeah. Like I want to see like I want to experience this.
Yeah. Well, I think about, like a good example is I think about the fact that I spent 8 years in the Navy, and that was never my plan. But there came to a point where I was like, hey, this is safe. This is secure. I should keep doing this for a little while longer until I have a solid plan. And that made sense at the time based on how I viewed the world. But like, I think if I was in that same position now, I wouldn't have done that. I would have just been like, let's roll the dice. Let's go be homeless for a little while if that's what ends up happening. Like, you know. Oh,
wow. Yeah, no, that's an extreme example. Yeah, that's crazy.
You know, and that was the thing is like, I was afraid of becoming homeless and not amounting to anything, and that the rest of my life would be a lot of suffering. And now I think that I probably wouldn't have gone that route. And I think that has to do with the belief system, right? Like, and I guess that actually explains the difference between our use of the word imperative and convenient. Like, for me, it's almost like, hey, you need this. You really need that foundation, because without it, you're always going to be playing it safe and you're always going to be holding back. If you don't have something, you know, telling you, hey, it's going to be okay, like there's a lifeguard on duty, like jump in the pool, like go do it. Like it's, you know, it's going to be okay at the end of the day. Even if you like, and that okay. And when I say okay, doesn't mean that like you won't die or you won't, you know, spend the rest of your life in squalor. It's like that itself is okay because that isn't the end of the game. Like it's not over when that moment comes. There's always something else leading after that. Whether it's the next experience or whether it's some kind of great awakening or you know, spreading your energy out into the universe to be manifested in other things, like whatever it is. Like there's something else out there. It's always going to keep going, so don't worry about what happens here.
Yeah. It's well, the way you say it always keeps going reminds me again of fractals.
Yeah.
Like it's just going to keep reflecting outward and inward perpetually. And I guess actually we were talking about, you know, ways to describe God in words. I thought about this earlier and just remembered. I would think of if existence is fractals, God is the fractal, like in its entirety, is kind of the way I think of God. And then the other way is, we mentioned Eastern religion a lot, the Tao. I think that's a really good way of describing what I think God is. Like the way of things, just like if I had to describe God, actually I might start calling it this, I would refer to it as the will.
The will.
The will.
I dig it.
Like something that wills things into existence, something that wills a direction that those things should strive toward, or are just going to strive toward, depending on their level of consciousness. Like that's how I think of God, as because existence exists, the thing that rules over all of that is God, the will.
Nice. Cool. I think that's a good place to end it. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Awesome. All right, man. Until next week.
Peace outside.